If you're having a difficult time memorizing the fretboard, here are 3 reasons why you could be having some trouble. The first thing is that most people try to practice too much information at once. So they'll memorize the fretboard in a similar way that they memorize the strings of the guitar. When you're first picking up the guitar and you memorize the names of the strings, you do it one by one, E, A, D, so on and so forth. And you might use like a fun little trick, like a sentence, Eddie ate dynamite, goodbye Eddie, something like that, to help you memorize the names of the strings. And then they'll think, okay, I did that for the open strings, why don't I just do that for each individual fret? And they'll memorize the first fret, and they'll say, okay, F, B flat, E flat, so on and so forth, right? The problem with this method is that you're trying to memorize 6 pieces of information at the same time. And then you're doing that 12 times over. 12 times 6, it's a lot of information. And even just the groupings of 6 is a little bit too much. For example, this YouTube video, I'm telling you 3 things. Lots of times our brains do really well when we pare it down to just 2 pieces of information, 3 pieces of information. So if you can go from practicing like 6 pieces of information down to something more manageable, like just 2 or just 3, that would be really helpful. Another thing that a lot of people do is they'll say, okay, I'm going to memorize every C note across the fretboard. And they're like, okay, here's a C, here's a C, goodness, here's a C, here's a C, here's a C, here's a C. It's so funny how I get a little nervous when I'm doing these YouTube videos. But anyway, and then they'll say, okay, I have all my C notes down. Now I'm going to memorize all the F notes. So F, 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 right? And then they'll be like, okay, I'm going to do that for all 12 notes. But again, you're memorizing 6 pieces of information with that method. So if you compare it down to just like 2 or 3, like, okay, I'm just going to focus on memorizing the C note on the first 2 strings until I get really comfortable with that. Now I'm just going to add 1 more additional piece of information to that. So now I'm going to add the C note on the D string and just kind of cycle through these and practice through that and just add a little piece of information at a time. In my guitar program, where I help students memorize the fretboard in 2 months, what I do is we take it 1 string at a time, and we start with 3 notes. So we would start with an E note, we would then have a B note, and then a G note. So you're just practicing those 3 notes, and once you get comfortable with those 3 notes, it's like, okay, let's just add 2 more. So we're going from 3 notes to 5 notes. So it's like, okay, now in addition to the E, the B, and the G, let's add the A note and the D note. Okay, so now we're just practicing between those 5 notes. We're practicing exercises that is basically asking us to do it in a random order each time so that we're not doing it by thinking about the shapes, but really understanding each note as an individual note. And then once you're really comfortable with 5, and it could take you a couple days to get comfortable with 5 notes on just 1 string, right? Once you're comfortable with 5, then we move on to 7 notes. And then after 7, we can fill in the sharps and the flats and take it to 12 notes. But that's just 1 string, right? The next thing we do in the program is we would follow that same logic, but this time on the B string. So then we're memorizing 3 notes on just the B string. And you do that for a couple days until you're comfortable with it. Once you're comfortable with it, we can move on, add it to 5 notes. You do that until you're comfortable with it, then you add it to 7 notes. So you can see how we are practicing small pieces of information at a time and getting really, really comfortable with that small piece of information before we're adding new stuff on top of it. A lot of times people will try and practice too much information at the same time, and it's too much for our brains to truly digest, and then you're not making any progress and you want to give up because you're not seeing yourself make any progress. But the whole issue is that we started trying to do too much from the very beginning. So without getting into, I feel like I've exhausted this point so far. So that's the first point, is that maybe try to practice just less information at a time. The second thing that could be a reason why you are having trouble memorizing the fretboard is that you're not sticking with a method long enough to actually see it work for yourself. Most guitar players never even memorize the fretboard, so the fact that you're here and you're watching this video and this is something that you're committed to doing, it already puts you in that top percentage of guitar players. But yeah, most people won't memorize the fretboard because they start with a method and then they give up after maybe a couple days or maybe a couple weeks. But it takes a while to memorize the fretboard. In my guitar program, we do it in 2 months, or 2 months is kind of the fastest way that we would do it. But that's honestly super, super fast for most people. Guitar players who do end up memorizing the fretboard, it'll usually take a year, a couple years, honestly. For myself, it took me about 3 or 4 years to memorize the fretboard, really. Of course, I could figure out where notes were, but to get to that point where I had all the notes very quickly available on every string, it takes a good amount of time. So if you're starting a method and then only doing it for a couple days or a couple weeks, and then changing to a new method, and then constantly changing to a new method, you're not giving each method enough time to truly develop so that you can get to that point where you have the fretboard memorized. So that's the second reason why you're having trouble memorizing the fretboard. And then the third reason that a lot of people have trouble memorizing the fretboard is that they are not tracking the progress, or they're not able to see the progress that they're making. A lot of this has to do with the first 2 points as well. So if you're trying to cover too much information at once, you're not going to be able to make progress. So you're not going to be able to see any of the progress that you're making. And then exactly with the second point that I just mentioned, if you're constantly changing methods, then you're not going to make a whole lot of progress with that either. So our human brains, it's very difficult for us to do the same thing over and over and over without seeing any progress. We get bored, we get discouraged, and we decide to go do something else. So being able to see the progress that we're making is super, super important for us. That's why in my guitar program, the method that I use, we start on one string with the 3 notes. And then once we get that down, we get to move on to the next step, which is a small step, but it's the next step of adding those 2 additional notes. So now we're doing 5 notes, and then we take the next step to 7 notes, and then we take the next step of doing that whole process on the next string. And then we take the next step of doing that same process, but this time across 2 strings. And then we build it up from there, right? So the same process, but on the 3rd string, and then the same process, adding the 3rd string and the 2nd string together, and then we have to do the same process with the 3 strings together. And every step along the way, even though, maybe it might take a day or 2 or 3 to really get that step down, the fact that we're taking steps and we can see the progress that we're making, it's reinforcing to our brains that we're doing something well and we're making motion towards our goal, which is super, super important. So take these in mind when you are trying to memorize the fretboard. That 1, make sure you're not asking too much of yourself, practicing too much information at once. Just pare the information down to something that you can accomplish in just a couple days. That's super, super important. 2, whatever method it is that you're using, make sure that you stick to it long enough to give yourself the chance of success. Because anything worth doing in life, it's going to take longer than a couple days or a couple weeks, especially when it comes to memorizing the fretboard. And the third thing is, make sure that you have a very specific way that you can measure your progress so that you can encourage yourself and that you decrease the likelihood that you give up on the method that you've chosen. So if you'd like to find out more about how we memorize the fretboard in my guitar program, feel free to check out the pinned video on my YouTube channel, or you can find me on Instagram and send me a message. Otherwise, thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you in the next video.